Hello everyone, tonight we're going somewhere beautifully miserable, the winters of North America's heartland. Back when the snow didn't just fall, it hunted. Imagine trying to survive in a world where your central heating was a pile of dried buffalo dung, where one wrong breath could reveal your position to a starving wolf, and where even melting snow for water could cost you your last fire. These weren't just cold months, they were 9-month interrogations conducted by the weather itself. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching history get frostbite. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm curious how far the warmth reaches tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, preferably not made of buffalo hide, and let the room go quiet for a second. Listen for that faint hum of the wind outside. That's where we begin, buried in snow, surrounded by silence, and somehow still breathing. There's nothing romantic about snow when it's trying to kill you. The Great Plains in winter weren't the gentle, postcard kind of white. They were the kind that erased entire worlds. Snow didn't fall softly, it advanced. It swallowed the horizon first, then the trails, then the sound of your own breathing. For most of human history, this wasn't a landscape, it was an ambush. The wind didn't whistle, it screamed like something ancient and offended. Temperatures fell so low they stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like punishment. At -30 degrees Celsius, even the air seemed to splinter. When the sky turned that flat, metallic grey, the color of despair and old tin, everyone knew the rules changed. There were no trees to block the wind, no mountains to hide behind. Just flat infinity and the occasional buffalo skeleton, half buried in frost. You could see a storm coming for hours, but you couldn't escape it. It was like being hunted in slow motion. People who lived there, Lakota, Cheyenne, Mandan, Arikara, didn't think of winter as a season. It was a personality, and not a pleasant one. They treated it with a mixture of fear, respect, and logistical precision. The modern notion of winter blues would have sounded adorable to them. Depression was a luxury you couldn't afford when your eyelids could freeze shut mid-blink. Every action before the first snowfall was a form of preemptive apology to nature. Hides were scraped, meat dried, caches buried, lodges repaired, all before the sky began lowering itself onto the earth like a lid. When the wind shifted, even the horses grew silent. They knew what was coming. The blizzards moved across the plains with military efficiency, marching in white columns that reduced visibility to the length of a single outstretched arm. People tied ropes between lodges just to find their way home. Step too far from the cord, and you disappeared into the kind of silence that swallows footprints and prayers alike. Firewood was more valuable than gold, and twice as difficult to find. The treeless expanse of the Central Plains meant that every stick, every splinter, every piece of driftwood carried miles of effort. Sometimes, when no wood was left, the people burned buffalo dung dried, gathered, and stored like treasure. It smelled atrocious, but it worked. It also made for lively jokes, because when the blizzard howled outside, and you were huddled inside burning excrement for warmth, humor was one of the few fuels you didn't have to ration. By January, the world stopped pretending to be alive. Even the rivers seemed to hold their breath, locked under slabs of ice so thick you could hear them moan at night. The sound wasn't mystical. It was the ice cracking and expanding, but no one mistook it for anything ordinary. On the plains, superstition wasn't weakness. It was data, gathered over centuries of barely surviving. And yet, despite the brutality, there was order. The people knew which valleys to camp in, which slopes broke the wind, which buffalo trails offered shelter when nothing else did. They knew that the sun, if it rose at all, would only mock them with its brightness before disappearing again behind the next front. Survival wasn't luck, it was choreography. Miss one step, and you froze before you fell. Somewhere in all that frozen emptiness, humanity discovered that warmth isn't a temperature, it's an agreement. You share food, breath, fire, and silence, and in return, winter might let you see spring again. Maybe, but that was only the beginning. Because once you learned how to stay alive, you still had to learn where to do it. Nothing on the Great Plains stayed still for long, especially people. Movement was the only real insurance policy, and timing it right meant the difference between survive the winter and became a footnote in an archaeological dig. The Plains tribes Lakota, Cheyenne, Mandan, Arapaho, Pawnee, and their neighbors were mathematicians disguised as nomads. Their calculations weren't written down, but they were exact, part astronomy, part animal behavior, and part common sense born from watching people freeze to death, one generation too many. When the first northern winds sharpened their teeth, the counting began. Buffalo herds started drifting south, and everyone else followed, not because it was warmer, but because the animals knew where food still grew under the snow. You could trust the buffalo more than the sky. They were barometers with hooves, forecasting the weather months ahead by doing something humans never mastered, leaving early. Every migration was a slow-motion miracle of logistics. Families took down tipis that could weigh over 100 kilos when frozen, wrapped them around travois poles, and dragged them behind horses across plains that looked identical in every direction. There were no landmarks, no turn left at the big rock. The horizon was an unbroken lie. And yet they found their way, by stars, by wind, by instinct so refined it bordered on GPS. Winter camps weren't chosen for beauty or view. They were chosen for survival geometry. The best sites were low valleys or river bends with cottonwood stands that broke the wind and trapped drifts. Snow is insulation, not enemy. Buffalo liked those spots too, which helped. When a band found one of these rare sanctuaries, they treated it with the reverence modern people reserve for Wi-Fi. You didn't disturb a good camp. You thanked it and remembered it. The migration was also a test of hierarchy. Leaders who picked the wrong route risked their authority, or everyone's life. Hunters rode ahead to scout, shelter, and game. Elders advised from memory, recalling storms 50 winters old. Memory was currency here. The old ones didn't tell stories. They issued meteorological warnings disguised as myths. A tale about a man who ignored the geese flying low was not entertainment. It was a footnoted lecture titled How Not to Die of Hubris Near the Powder River. Moving an entire camp in sub-zero wind wasn't glamorous. Horses stumbled, children cried, hides cracked from cold. Every sound was muffled except the creaking of leather and the wind scraping across the snow. The only warmth came from motion itself. They didn't travel so much as migrate, like arteries pumping blood through a frozen continent. When the final move was done and the new camp raised, there was no celebration, just a long silence of exhaustion and relief. Dogs curled into the snow, smoke began to rise again, and people pretended they'd reached safety. They hadn't. They'd simply reached the next equation in the endless arithmetic of survival. Because staying alive wasn't just about finding where to stop. It was about building something that could stand against the wind when everything else was already collapsing. And that's where the real genius began, in the architecture of warmth itself. It's hard to overstate how difficult it is to build a home on land that refuses to stay still. The Great Plains weren't generous. They were a flat negotiation table between wind and endurance. You didn't build against nature out here, you built around it, or you froze while trying. The people of the plains were engineers long before the word existed, turning air, hide, and instinct into insulation. The tipi wasn't a tent. It was an aerodynamic survival machine perfected over centuries of field testing by families who couldn't afford to fail twice. Each tipi was designed like a compromise with the gods of weather. The conical shape wasn't aesthetic. It was aerodynamic. The wind hit it and split, rolling over the surface instead of tearing it down. The poles, stripped and aligned, leaned inward with mathematical precision. The hides, buffalo. Later canvas was stitched and overlapped so tightly that they trapped heat, yet breathed enough to vent smoke. Even the smoke flaps were adjustable, because the wind direction could turn your shelter into either a sauna or a snow-filled nightmare in 5 minutes flat. Inside, the logic continued. The fire pit sat at the center, small, never roaring, because too much flame meant too much smoke, and too much smoke meant coughing yourself into hypothermia. Around it, hides were layered like geological strata, buffalo robes, wolf pelts, woven mats, all piled to keep the cold from rising through the frozen ground. Every inch of design came from generations of experimentation, the anthropology of trial and near-death. Up north, among the Mandan and Arikara, the approach was even more architectural. Their earth lodges were half-buried fortresses, built from timber, sod, and willpower. The walls were thick enough to block the worst wind, and the roof, supported by massive cottonwood beams, was covered in layers of packed clay and grass. It trapped warmth so effectively that snow melted off its surface in midwinter, creating small steaming mounds in an otherwise frozen landscape. You could stand inside, hear the storm shrieking outside, and feel almost like you had beaten nature. But comfort was relative. Smoke blackened the ceilings and lungs equally. The interior air was always somewhere between warm and unbreathable. You smelled like smoke, slept in smoke, prayed in smoke. It soaked into your hair, your skin, and eventually your definition of normal. And yet, that haze was what separated the living from the monuments. Nothing in these shelters was accidental. Even the direction the door faced mattered, usually east, to greet the morning sun, but also to turn the opening away from the prevailing winds. Every detail, from the placement of the fire to the storage of dried meat along the walls, was part of a larger system designed to outthink the cold. When snow reached the roofline, and it always did, people didn't panic. They reinforced the base with more snow, turning the drift into insulation. What looked like burial from the outside was actually protection from within. The plains people understood something modern builders forgot, that warmth isn't about heat. It's about control, controlling loss, controlling flow, controlling air that refuses to stay still. And once they'd built a home that could stand against the wind, the next question came with the first spark. How to keep the fire alive without turning the whole thing into an ashtray. Fire was the only thing standing between life and the kind of silence that freezes thought mid-sentence. But on the plains, it wasn't a luxury, it was a negotiation. You didn't just light a fire, you earned it. Every ember came from miles of scavenging and a precise balance between oxygen, fuel, and patience. People like to think of the Great Plains as endless grasslands. In winter, they were endless nothing. Wood was rarer than mercy. Trees only grew along rivers or in deep ravines where the wind forgot to visit. So a family's supply of fuel was planned months ahead. Cottonwood, when they could find it, burned too fast. Willow produced heat that vanished before you could enjoy it. The real treasure was buffalo dung, dried and stacked in neat, unglamorous pyramids beside every lodge. They called them buffalo chips, which sounds charming until you realize it's literally manure that doubles as central heating. You had to let it dry for weeks, sometimes turning it in the sun like fine wine. When burned, it gave off steady heat, minimal smoke, and a smell that could best be described as character building. The fire was always small, controlled, efficient, and treated like a heartbeat. It sat in the middle of the lodge, surrounded by stones that stored warmth and reflected light onto walls the color of old amber. At night, the flicker turned everything into moving shadow. Families became silhouettes. Smoke twisted like a spirit, and the roof flaps above glowed faintly orange against the black sky. Managing that fire was an art form. Too much fuel, and the smoke thickened until eyes watered and lungs begged for mercy. Too little, and frost crept down the walls like a slow-moving predator. Children learned early that their nightly duty wasn't storytelling or song. It was banking the coals, covering them with ash so the fire slept instead of dying. Waking to a cold hearth meant starting from scratch, often with flint that refused to spark or tinder so damp it mocked your efforts. Smoke was its own resident deity. It chose where to go, usually not out the smoke flaps, but straight into your face. The design of tipis tried to coax it upward through an opening that could be widened or closed, depending on wind, but the plains had opinions of their own. Some nights, smoke lingered stubbornly, turning every conversation into a wheeze. People adapted. They sat low, faces near the ground where air was clearer, eyes red but alive. The smell of burning buffalo dung, mixed with hide and wood smoke, clung to every garment. Outsiders once called it primitive. Insiders called it home. There was a strange intimacy in that air. The shared breath of people, animals, and fire, circulating endlessly in a space smaller than a modern living room, yet containing an entire ecosystem of survival. And fire wasn't just warmth, it was company. The hiss and crackle were the soundtracks to long nights where wind beat the lodge like a drum. Around it, people sang softly, repaired tools, and carved bone needles by the glow. The smoke rose, carrying whispers and prayers to the dark outside, because on the plains, warmth wasn't measured by degrees. It was measured by how many breaths still condensed in the air come morning by weather. The fire, against all odds, had remembered to stay alive through the night. And even with a good fire, survival demanded something that lasted longer than flame, something that didn't spoil, rot, or vanish before the next blizzard arrived. When the world turned into a frozen museum, food wasn't just nourishment, it was prophecy. Every mouthful you ate in February had been predicted in July. The plains didn't allow improvisation. You couldn't hunt when the herds vanished under ice, and you couldn't fish when the rivers became glass. So the only real question each winter was whether you'd planned enough to outlast the snow, or whether you were about to discover what desperation tastes like. Preservation was both chemistry and devotion. The summer hunt wasn't a celebration of abundance, it was a race against decay. After the buffalo fell, the air filled with the rhythm of knives, hundreds of hands slicing meat into long ribbons, thin enough to dry before bacteria remembered how to exist. The sun did the rest. Once crisped, the strips were pounded with fat and crushed berries into dense, brown bricks known as pemmican. It didn't look like much, but it could outlive the hunter who made it. Pemmican was the miracle food of the plains, portable, calorie-dense, and borderline immortal. One pouch could keep you alive through a blizzard or a siege, depending on which came first. It didn't spoil, it didn't freeze solid, and it could be eaten raw or boiled into a kind of soup that tasted like despair but worked like medicine. When the nights grew long and cruel, families measured safety not in warmth, but in how many bags of pemmican still hung from the rafters. It wasn't the only insurance. Wild turnips, choke cherries, and corn were dried or cached underground in pits, sealed with grass and clay, primitive refrigerators that fooled both wolves and frost. These pits dotted the plains like invisible lifelines. The Mandan and Hidatsa were especially skilled at it, creating entire subterranean pantries where hundreds of kilos of food could sleep untouched for months. The smell of these stores, earthy, slightly sweet, unmistakably alive, was the smell of relief. Because running out of food didn't mean go to the market. It meant walking into the wind and not coming back. Famine was never dramatic. It arrived quietly, disguised as smaller portions and longer silences around the fire. Protein wasn't wasted either. Marrow was scooped from bones and stored in hide bags. Tallow hardened into fuel for lamps and calories for later. Nothing was left to rot, not because of principle, but because decay was the enemy. In a world where you could freeze to death in your sleep, the concept of leftovers didn't exist. There was also the unspoken rule of communal hunger. If one family starved, others did too. A single shared meal during a storm wasn't generosity, it was strategy. You kept your neighbors alive because their survival raised your own odds. The act of passing dried meat across the fire was an unwritten treaty against extinction. And yet, even the best planners had limits. A blizzard could last weeks. Hunting could fail. A cache could be found by wolves. That's when the hierarchy of food blurred. Dogs were fed less, roots were chewed raw, and hope itself became a kind of ration. Still, through it all, the people of the plains understood something modern diets forget, that food isn't luxury, or comfort, or flavor, it's continuity. It's the stubborn refusal of life to end quietly. But eating meant little without the right protection, because warmth couldn't just live in your stomach. It had to be worn on your skin. Warmth on the plains wasn't something you felt. It was something you built. Every piece of clothing was an argument against extinction, layer after layer of defiance, stitched by hands that understood what a -30-degree wind could do to human flesh. You didn't dress for fashion. You dressed like the weather was out for revenge. The women, because it was almost always women, were the quiet engineers of survival. They knew which hides breathed, which trapped heat, and which turned stiff as stone when frozen. Buffalo was king, thick, oily, and lined with hair dense enough to mock the wind. Deerhide came next, softer, more flexible, ideal for leggings and shirts. Elk, moose, coyote, wolf, each had its place in the winter architecture of skin. Tanning was chemistry disguised as tradition. Brains were used as emulsifiers, smoke as sealant, patience as currency. The result wasn't fabric, it was armor. Garments were layered strategically, fur side in to trap heat, smooth side out to block snow. Women sewed with sinew, not thread, because sinew shrank when wet, tightening the seams naturally. It was, in effect, the world's first self-sealing technology, minus the patent. Footwear demanded its own genius. Moccasins, lined with rabbit fur and wrapped in extra hide, were worn inside overshoes made from buffalo leg skins. People carried spare pairs because wet shoes froze faster than gossip. And mittens weren't delicate accessories, they were small pouches of life, fingers huddled together like refugees, sharing warmth instead of pretending to be independent. Every sound in winter was muted except the soft creak of frozen hide. People moved like quiet machinery, muffled, layered, deliberate. Each step was a compromise between flexibility and insulation. The wind could howl, claw, and demand entry, but the seams didn't yield. It wasn't comfort, it was containment. Children were swaddled in rabbit pelts until they resembled overfed snow spirits. Infants slept in cradleboards lined with fur, their breath warming a tiny space so efficiently that it formed its own microclimate. A baby's first lesson was thermodynamics. Stay still, stay warm, stay alive. Decoration existed, but it never separated beauty from purpose. Quillwork and beadwork weren't vanity. They reinforced stitching, marking where stress lines met. Even aesthetics had a survival function. A beaded pattern wasn't just identity, it was reinforcement with flair. When traders eventually brought wool blankets and cloth, the people didn't discard tradition, they adapted it. Blankets became cloaks, layered with hides, cut into coats. Adaptation wasn't surrender, it was evolution under duress. A good winter outfit could weigh 30 pounds, smell faintly of smoke and fat, and keep you alive in temperatures that could crack rock. The irony was that the only part of the body exposed to the cold, the face, was the one that revealed how well the system worked. Frost gathered on eyebrows, lashes, and hair until everyone looked ancient and ghostly. In those moments, survival had its own aesthetic, shimmering, silent, slightly supernatural. And under all that fur and hide, there was still one resource that no clothing could protect: water. Because on the plains, dying of thirst surrounded by snow wasn't a metaphor, it was a daily risk. There's a cruel sort of comedy in freezing to death while surrounded by the planet's largest supply of water. The Great Plains in winter were proof that nature has a dark sense of humor. Everything around you was technically drinkable, glittering, beautiful, and fatal if you tried it wrong. Melted snow could save your life, but it could also take it if you used too much fuel or too little sense. Water wasn't fetched, it was negotiated. Rivers froze solid from bank to bank, their surfaces gleaming like glass and groaning like something alive underneath. People chipped holes through the ice with stone tools or iron axes when trade goods allowed, scooping water by the handful before it froze. You had seconds before the hole sealed again, locking your reflection inside like a ghost. Melting snow for drinking was the backup plan, and it came with rules. You didn't eat snow directly, not unless you wanted your body temperature to nosedive, and your insides to start arguing about survival. You gathered it in hide bags or clay pots and held it near the fire, turning it to water slowly, always watching the fuel, because fuel was life, and melting snow was the hungriest task of all. A single pot of water might devour the night's entire heat supply, so every sip had to be balanced against the risk of freezing later. It was a strange arithmetic, thirst versus warmth. And since dehydration didn't feel like danger at first, no sweat, no warning, it crept in quietly, numbing judgment long before limbs. The women, again, were the scientists of this operation. They learned to catch frost melt from hides hung near the smoke flaps, to collect icicles dripping from lodge edges, to save the last lukewarm inch of cooking water and reboil it with bone fragments. Efficiency wasn't thriftiness, it was ritual. Nothing, not even condensation, went to waste. Sometimes, when blizzards buried everything, people melted snow in their hands, pressing it into leather pouches warmed against their bodies. The resulting trickle was just enough to wet lips, not enough to satisfy. But satisfaction wasn't the point. Continuity was. Snow also shaped etiquette. In midwinter, offering someone water was a gesture of trust, not because it was scarce, but because it represented fire, labor, and a piece of your own body heat. You could share meat easily. Water meant giving time and warmth. There was no word for that kind of generosity in English, but on the plains it was understood without needing to be spoken. And yet, even with all this care, dehydration came for the careless. Lips cracked until they bled, tongues swelled, skin turned to parchment. The body could survive hunger for weeks, but thirst was faster, meaner. People who wandered away from camp sometimes died with snow on their faces, mouths open, as if mocking the joke of it all. Still, the plains people mastered the paradox, finding life in the same element that threatened it. They knew that water, like the wind, had to be respected more than trusted. And in that same logic, they looked to the animals, not as metaphors, but as instructors. Because if anyone knew how to survive in a frozen desert, it was the ones who never built fires at all. Long before satellites or weather apps, there were buffalo, and prairie dogs, and geese, and 1,000 other non-human barometers who read the land better than any priest or politician. On the Great Plains, animals weren't background scenery, they were the unofficial meteorological department. You watched them because not watching them got you killed. The buffalo were the first and most reliable prophets. When herds began drifting south, people packed their tipis without debate. It wasn't instinct, it was policy. Buffalo didn't move for comfort, they moved for survival. Their migration mapped the seasons more accurately than any human calendar carved on bone. Follow the herds and you'd find grass, water, and a few degrees of mercy. Stay behind and you'd find fossils. The buffalo also built civilization one hide at a time. They provided meat, shelter, fuel, thread, glue, and in winter, a strange sort of companionship. A good robe, thick with underfur, could turn a blizzard into a tolerable insult. When the U.S. Army began exterminating herds in the 19th century, it wasn't just an ecological disaster, it was the removal of heating, clothing, and prophecy in one military order. Smaller creatures spoke in subtler dialects. Prairie dogs, for example, were tiny meteorologists with excellent timing. When they sealed their burrows with packed dirt, it meant a storm was on its way, and they were never wrong. The Lakota used to say the little rodents could hear the cold coming, and modern barometric science would have agreed if it had ears sharp enough. Birds, too, dictated the calendar. When the sky filled with geese flying low and loud, it was a public announcement. Get your life in order. Winter is boarding the train. Their flight lines traced invisible highways that guided both human migrations and dreams. Owls, on the other hand, were less encouraging. Hearing one at night near camp could mean death or change, depending on who you asked. Either way, no one ignored it. Even wolves had a voice in the Council of Survival. Their howls carried far in the cold, bending around snowdrifts like sonar. If wolves went silent, something was wrong. The air too still, the temperature about to drop, or the herds moving unnaturally. The relationship was pragmatic, competition in the hunt, alliance in information. Humans listened because the wolves didn't lie. Domesticated animals learned the script, too. Horses turned their rumps to the wind hours before a front arrived. Dogs curled tighter, their tails covering their noses. Some families tied thin cords to dogs' tails so they could read shifts in the wind inside the lodge. It wasn't superstition, it was data collection using fur. Every movement, every sound had meaning. Snowshoe hares turning white signaled the final curtain of autumn. The absence of crows meant deep cold coming. The return of magpies hinted at mercy. It was a living language, and humans were just barely literate in it. To survive on the plains meant joining that conversation, not dominating it. You didn't conquer nature, you apprenticed under it. And those who paid attention found something else hiding in the wind, not just weather patterns, but messages carried on sound itself. Because when the land froze and the world went quiet, the wind began to speak. The Great Plains were never silent. Even in the dead of winter, when everything seemed frozen into obedience, the air was still talking, just not in words most people understood. The wind had a language of its own, older than bone, fluent in geography and malice. It didn't whisper, it lectured, the kind of voice that could strip bark from trees and optimism from the living. To the untrained ear, every gust sounded the same, but those who'd spent their lives in that ocean of cold learned to read its moods. A soft hiss meant clear skies. A low, steady hum through the lodge poles meant snow within a day. A sudden silence, the eerie, unnatural kind that made even dogs pause mid-breath, meant a storm was assembling somewhere beyond the horizon. Nature never went quiet without reason. Old men could predict blizzards by the taste of air. They'd step outside, squint, and say things like the sky smells round. Outsiders thought it poetic nonsense. It wasn't. The shift in humidity and static pressure before a blizzard gave the air a dull metallic tamps, not metaphorically, but literally. Your tongue could tell what your eyes couldn't yet see. The wind was also the memory of the land. It carried dust from the Badlands, salt from ancient seabeds, the faint smell of buffalo herds miles away. When it changed direction, so did everyone else. Even the horses learned the cues. They'd turn their backs to the wind long before it picked up, instinctively conserving heat, predicting disaster better than any human prayer. In the nights before a big storm, the wind became performance art. It howled down the smoke flaps, set the lodge walls trembling, and played the poles like a drum. Children hid under furs, wide-eyed. Elders didn't calm them. They listened, counting the rhythm. A certain cadence meant dry snow, survivable. A shriek that rose and broke like a scream meant sleet, deadly. People didn't call it listening to the wind because it sounded mystical. They called it that because not listening was suicidal. Entire camps had been lost to storms that arrived faster than expected, swallowed without ceremony. The survivors told stories afterward, not for drama but for data. The wind was sharp as bone, they'd say, meaning it carried ice. The wind went heavy, meaning the snow would stick and pile instead of blowing through. It was a lexicon of endurance. And beneath all the noise was something subtler, the constant reminder that humans were temporary guests in a land shaped entirely by motion. Every gust erased footprints, smoothed scars, and reminded the living that permanence was a delusion. The same wind that froze your fingers also carried your scent to wolves, your prayers to no one in particular, and your history into the next valley. Still, within that harsh voice, there was rhythm. When the blizzard finally broke, the air softened into a lullaby. You could hear ice cracking, fire sighing back to life, dogs shaking off frost. That brief calm wasn't silence, it was recovery. The wind had paused to breathe, and so did the people. But rest never lasted long. The next sound wasn't the winds, but laughter and voices. The murmur of camps huddled together in tight circles. Because when the sky decided to bury the world, survival stopped being an individual skill and became a collective art. No one survived the plains alone. That wasn't philosophy, it was physics. When the temperature dropped low enough to freeze breath mid-air, warmth became a group project. Community wasn't sentimental, it was thermal regulation. The lone wanderer, the stoic individualist, those were myths invented by people who'd never heard their own bones ache from cold. On the plains, solitude was a luxury reserved for corpses. Winter camps were built like living organisms. Tipis and lodges clustered together, forming small villages in the lee of hills or river bends. Each shelter contributed its body heat to the others. Smoke rose in slow, synchronized spirals, as if the entire camp were breathing through one pair of lungs. The space between lodges was narrow by design, a kind of architecture of intimacy. The closer you lived, the more you survived. Inside, life rotated around the fire, but it was the shared fire that mattered most. Neighbors visited constantly, not for gossip but for maintenance, exchanging warmth, fuel, food, and conversation in equal measure. Each visit was insurance. If your fire goes out, come here. That wasn't hospitality, it was law. Food, too, belonged to everyone, in theory, and to no one entirely. A hunter's kill might feed 10 households. A family with surplus pemmican stored it for the ones who'd miscalculated. It wasn't charity, because debt didn't exist in a system where tomorrow's storm might erase the distinction between the generous and the grateful. What kept the camp alive wasn't fairness, it was circulation. The elders sat closest to the fire, not as a privilege, but as data centers. Their stories weren't entertainment. They were the oral equivalent of survival manuals. Each tale was a case study disguised as myth. How one ancestor found shelter, how another froze in pride, how the wind favored the patient. Laughter punctuated the lessons, because humor softened fear. If you could laugh at winter, you had already beaten part of it. Children learned early that silence was sacred. When storms pressed against the lodges, everyone lowered their voices. The cold outside had ears, so people spoke softly, and stories became whispers that threaded through the smoke like music. There was rhythm even in breathing. Families slept close, side by side, wrapped in furs, their collective warmth turning the air thick and survivable. Sometimes, when the snow finally stopped, there'd be a kind of fragile celebration. A few voices would sing, low and slow, not to gods, but to the weather itself, a truce song. Drums were too risky in deep cold. The skin froze and split, so people sang with their throats and feet, stamping in rhythm to prove they were still here. The song wasn't for joy, it was proof of existence. In these tight winter circles, power didn't belong to the strongest, but to the most dependable. The one who could mend a hide, calm a child, or keep a fire alive became more essential than any warrior. Survival had no hierarchy, only function. The measure of greatness was warmth, and when warmth ran out, it wasn't despair that held the camp together. It was routine, that quiet, unspoken agreement to keep doing the next necessary thing. You got up, tended the fire, checked the neighbors, shared what was left. The plains had a way of stripping heroism down to competence. Still, even competence needed its softest miracle: how to keep the smallest bodies alive when even the air itself turned predatory. Because if the adults fought the cold with skill, the children survived it through the genius of maternal design. Keeping a baby alive on the winter plains was an act of engineering disguised as tenderness. Infants are basically tiny furnaces with terrible insulation, adorable, yes, but profoundly unfit for -30 degrees Celsius winds. Yet somehow, they survived. Not because of luck or miracles, but because mothers knew how to build warmth from almost nothing. Survival was a skill passed down in lullabies. The first rule: never let cold air touch new skin. Babies were kept in fur-lined cradle boards, swaddled so tightly in rabbit, deer, or buffalo hair that they barely moved. The cradle itself wasn't just a carrier, it was a portable habitat, sealed and layered like an early version of a space capsule. Only the face peeked out, framed by soft fur that caught each exhale and recycled the warmth back in. You could see frost form around the rim, proof that heat was being trapped, life retained. Mothers carried these small bundles against their own chests, sharing breath and heartbeat through hide layers. There were no bottles too warm, no strollers to push, just skin, rhythm, and vigilance. The child's body temperature was monitored, not with thermometers, but by instinct: a hand to the cheek, a breath across the nose, a mother's intuition so finely tuned it could compete with meteorology. Inside the lodges, infants were placed near the fire, but never in direct line of smoke. Too close, and lungs filled with ash. Too far, and frost crept back in. The sweet spot was somewhere between survival and suffocation, and every mother learned it. Even the smoke, though hated, had purpose. It cured hides, repelled insects, and coated the baby's cradle in a thin film of soot that acted as natural insulation. Warmth and filth went hand in hand. Nights were the true tests. Mothers stayed half awake, feeding embers with one hand while checking the child with the other. Babies slept through wind that could rattle the poles, because the fire and heartbeat merged into the same steady sound, the ancient soundtrack of endurance. Crying was rare, not because babies didn't cry, but because the air was too cold for long wailing. Mothers learned to quiet them fast, not out of impatience, but because a screaming child loses heat faster than any flame can give it back. There were small inventions, too. Fur hoods that caught condensation from the child's breath, rabbit hair plugs in ears during high wind, even warmed stones wrapped in hide and tucked near the cradle. Nothing wasted, nothing improvised, every detail refined by centuries of repetition. But perhaps the most brilliant design was social. Babies were everyone's concern. Aunts, grandmothers, even older siblings took turns tending fires and checking the smallest sleepers. A crying infant was never ignored. It was a communal alarm clock announcing that the night wasn't over and the cold was still winning. To outsiders, the idea of raising children in those conditions sounds tragic. To those who lived it, it was simply rhythm. Children learned to survive by listening, not to lessons, but to silence. The quiet hum of breathing, the soft hiss of snow on hide, the unspoken agreement that life, however fragile, was a duty shared. And when those same children grew older, the silence became their teacher. Because the next stage of survival, the hunt, demanded not warmth, but stillness. Winter hunting on the plains wasn't the dramatic, galloping spectacle painters later imagined. There were no heroic charges through snowdrifts or cinematic showdowns with beasts. Hunting in deep cold was slow, quiet, and deeply humiliating if you made a sound. The animals were hungrier, sharper, and more suspicious than ever, and they had fur, which gave them the unfair advantage of not dying instantly if the wind shifted. The hunters moved like ghosts, wrapped in hides so thick they barely bent their knees. Every creak of leather sounded like a shout. Bows were swaddled in hide, bowstrings kept under furs to stop them from freezing stiff. Arrowheads were warmed before use. Cold metal shattered bone, but also fingers. The rule was simple: make no unnecessary sound, waste no unnecessary motion, and never, ever, let your breath fog where prey could see it. The snow betrayed everyone. It squeaked, crunched, whispered gossip to the deer, so hunters spread their weight, stepping toe first, heel never touching down fully. They read the wind the way priests read omens, by taste and by feel, knowing one wrong exhale could carry a human scent across half a valley. You didn't stalk animals on the winter plains. You negotiated terms with them. Buffalo was still the prize, though by midwinter they were lean and wary, their hides thick as armor. A single kill could feed a camp for days, but approaching one meant hours of crawling, freezing, and pretending to be snow. When the shot finally came, an arrow or a spear, depending on the age of the story, the silence broke for only a heartbeat. Then came work. Long, cold, gruesome work. Every part of the animal was used before frost claimed it. Meat was sliced immediately, laid on rawhide sheets, or frozen solid for later. Blood was collected, warm and steaming to drink before it turned to crimson slush. Bones were split for marrow, sinew peeled for thread. Even the stomach became a vessel for storing fat, because nothing on the plains ever went to waste, not even discussed. Sometimes, when the herds vanished entirely, smaller prey filled the gap. Rabbits, birds, even prairie dogs. A well-placed snare meant another night of warmth. But winter hunting wasn't about heroism. It was about preventing starvation from becoming an inevitability. And starvation had manners here. It announced itself days in advance with weakness, dizziness, and a sudden interest in boiled leather. The hunters didn't travel alone, though solitude made for good legends. 2 or 3 moved together, each carrying not only weapons but stories, jokes whispered through scarves, small acts of rebellion against the quiet. Humor was the one thing that didn't freeze. A hunter who could make others laugh at 40 below could lead them anywhere. When they returned to camp, dragging meat, stiff as stone, there was no ceremony. Just the soft sound of knives being sharpened, the smell of fat hitting hot stones, and the first real feeling of safety in days. The hunt didn't end with the kill. It ended when the smoke rose, steady and blue, from the lodges again. But the true weight of survival wasn't measured in meat or hides. It was in the rituals that kept the spirit intact, the invisible architecture of belief that made endurance feel like meaning. Because on the plains, the line between survival and spirituality was thinner than frost on a buffalo's skull. Surviving the Great Plains wasn't only about calories and firewood, it was about negotiation with everything you couldn't control. Storms weren't just weather, they were moods. The wind wasn't mere air, it was an audience with opinions. So the people did what humans always do when faced with forces too large to reason with. They turned endurance into ritual. You didn't fight the winter. You respected it enough to ask it not to notice you. Every tribe had its own vocabulary for this kind of diplomacy. Among the Lakota, offerings of tobacco or sweetgrass were left at riverbanks, buried under the snow, a quiet message to the spirits who supposedly governed water and frost. The Cheyenne lit small fires at dawn, feeding them with cedar and words, meant not for prayer but for balance. As if by speaking gently, they could coax the sun into behaving. There was no line between religion and meteorology. One predicted the other. When the wind howled too long, some sang to it, not to stop it, but to keep themselves sane. The songs weren't beautiful. They were functional, rhythmic, repetitive, grounding, a way to remind the body that it still existed. Children grew up learning that fear could be converted into sound, and that silence, left unchecked, could drive a mind toward ghosts. The winter also had its gods, or at least its recurring personalities. The northern wind was a character everyone knew, impatient, quick to anger, easily flattered. People spoke about it as if it were a volatile relative who needed constant appeasement. When the first snow fell, elders reminded the young to greet it respectfully. "Don't curse the cold," they'd say. "It's listening." And everyone believed it was. Dreams, too, carried weight. Long nights invited visions of ancestors, animals, or things that didn't fit easily into language. Hunters who dreamed of wolves might wake confident. Those who saw crows stayed quiet all day. The line between spiritual and practical blurred entirely. Interpreting a dream correctly could mean adjusting the next hunt, avoiding the wrong valley, surviving another week. Even daily chores were steeped in reverence. Fire wasn't just lit, it was fed. Meat wasn't cooked, it was thanked before eating. A few scraps were cast into the flames for those who couldn't eat anymore. The ancestors, the lost, or whoever might be listening. To outsiders, it might look like superstition. To those living it, it was risk management on a cosmic scale. The Mandan, who wintered in earth lodges along the Missouri, told stories of spirits that walked in storms, not monsters, but auditors checking whether the living still remembered their manners. When the snow hissed against the door, people stayed quiet, respectful, even still. Movement could be misinterpreted. There was comfort in imagining that suffering had witnesses. Ritual was how the plains people insulated the mind when the body ran out of defenses. You could lose a hunt, lose your fire, even lose your way, but if you still knew the right words to sing into the wind, you weren't lost completely. And when that wind finally passed, leaving the camp half buried and the world eerily still, another ritual began, not one of worship, but of counting, because every act of survival came with a cost, and the plains always collected their due in full. When everything froze, belief was the one thing that stayed warm. Life on that open land wasn't just physical endurance, it was a conversation with the invisible. People didn't pray for survival, they prayed with it. The cold didn't care who you were, so you gave it respect, not resistance. Spiritual life wasn't about conquest or comfort, it was insulation for the soul. Storms were never just weather, they were personalities, moody, watchful, easily offended. The wind carried its own temperament, the snow its own verdict. Before a blizzard, families lit the fire in silence, offering tobacco to the flames, not because they thought the storm would stop, but because acknowledging its power was a form of negotiation. You bowed to nature so it wouldn't flatten you completely. Songs filled the gaps that tools couldn't fix. Low chants, often wordless, rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. The sound wasn't meant to reach the sky, it was meant to hold the air together. Voices in unison kept fear from splintering the camp. You could hear those murmurs at night, mixed with the hiss of snow on hide, and it felt less like prayer and more like a steady heartbeat, reminding the dark it hadn't won. Every act of survival had a sacred shadow. Tending a fire was ceremony, cutting meat, a ritual. Even the smoke curling upward was a messenger, a carrier of thoughts too fragile to speak aloud. The divide between practical and spiritual didn't exist, because the world didn't give you the privilege of separating them. You thanked the buffalo before skinning it. You greeted the dawn not because it was pretty, but because you were still here to see it. Winter tested more than bodies, it tested trust in unseen forces. Some called them spirits, others simply the helpers. The snow, the fire, the animals, all of them part of a network of mutual recognition. Disrespect one, and the others noticed. The people didn't worship nature as something above them. They lived inside it, like organs in a body. You didn't survive against it, you survived through it. When sickness came, frostbite, fever or despair, healers turned to both medicine and memory. They brewed roots into teas, burned sage, whispered names into the smoke. Modern language calls it superstition, but what it really was psychological armor. If you believed the wind listened, you weren't alone. If you thought the fire had intentions, you'd tend it more carefully. Faith, in that world, was functional. Rituals also preserved sanity. When days passed without sun, people held small gatherings, sharing dreams, retelling visions, reinterpreting omens. It wasn't mystical posturing, it was therapy with drums. Each story reaffirmed that meaning still existed, even when nothing else did. The belief system was both philosophy and insulation, invisible fur against invisible cold. And when spring finally hinted at return, a faint softening of wind, a raven's call that didn't sound like hunger, people didn't celebrate immediately. They waited. Gratitude came slowly, with caution, because survival was never guaranteed until the thaw revealed who hadn't made it. And every year, the thaw brought reminders, bones, tools, half-buried remnants of those who'd miscalculated the dialogue between human and season. Because the cost of one mistake wasn't theoretical, it was permanent. Winter didn't forgive. It didn't even bother to notice. One wrong move, one forgotten rope, one cracked water pot, one slightly misjudged storm, and the land erased you like a smudge on glass. There were no second chances, no noble deaths, no poetic last words whispered into the snow. People vanished mid-step, mid-thought, mid-life. Their absence explained later by the kind of silence that made everyone suddenly busy with the fire. The margin for error was microscopic. Leave a tippy flap untied, and the wind could shred the hide to ribbons before morning. Neglect to bank the embers, and you'd wake to ice on your blanket and breath frozen to your lips. Misread a cloud bank, and the storm arrived hours early, burying everything you'd built under 3 meters of indifference. The weather never punished, it simply performed quality control. Hunting parties that ventured too far sometimes didn't come back, not because of drama, but because distances lied in the cold. The horizon looked closer, the sun hung lower, and the mind, dulled by hunger and windburn, stopped counting steps. Tracks filled in minutes. The compass became a rumor, and the snow turned from ground into sky, until direction itself disappeared. When the search parties went out, they didn't hope to find survivors. They hoped to find outlines, the faint mound where someone had curled into their final decision. Bodies were discovered sitting upright, as if simply resting. That was the cruelest part. Death here was quiet. It came without theatrics, just sleep mistaken for surrender. But the mistakes weren't always fatal in the immediate sense. Sometimes they lived on as shortages, a misplaced food cache, a broken tool, a misjudged ration. A small oversight in November could echo into March, thinning the entire camp one cough at a time. The old ones noticed first. They'd stop eating. To help the children, they'd say, but everyone knew it was a form of accounting. Self-erasure as resource management. These errors became stories, recorded not in ink but in memory. Each loss was filed under a moral. Tie your flap, check your smoke, never trust the stillness. Winter was a teacher who charged tuition in flesh. The people learned fast because they had to, and every generation refined the lesson. The rituals, the schedules, the superstitions, they were all survival protocols with poetic packaging. Even so, not every tragedy was preventable. Sometimes, everything was done right, and the wind just decided otherwise. You could be clever, disciplined, perfectly prepared, and still lose. That knowledge bred a strange humility, not defeat, not despair, but a calm acceptance that control was always partial. When the thaw finally came, the cost was tallied. The dead emerged slowly, returned by the melting snow with a kind of bureaucratic precision. They weren't mourned with wailing, but with maintenance, tools reclaimed, stories retold, mistakes analyzed. Memory was both gravestone and survival manual, and from those lessons came a certain reverence for the season itself. A recognition that spring wasn't rebirth so much as an audit, because when the ice cracked and the rivers started to move again, the living had to face what the winter had taken and what, somehow, it had spared. Spring didn't arrive like a celebration. It arrived like an apology that took too long. The snow didn't melt. It revealed, first, the outlines of buried lodges, then the ribs of forgotten animals. Then, inevitably, the people who hadn't made it through. The land gave everything back, one slow confession at a time. You could hear it, the steady drip of ice surrendering, the low groan of rivers waking up. It wasn't rebirth. It was audit season. The first color to return wasn't green, it was brown. Mud, soggy hides, softened sinew, bones, half-risen from their white graves. Camp smelled of rot and smoke, the aroma of survival turning back into life. People stepped out, squinting, thinner, quieter, each face a mix of gratitude and suspicion. No one trusted warmth immediately. It had lied before. The thaw was work. Everything had to be repaired, dried, untangled, replaced. Tipis sagged under melting snow. Tools had rusted or cracked. Food stores were inspected with the seriousness of religion. Spoiled meat was burned, not buried. No one wanted ghosts with digestive issues. And beneath the practical chores ran a private current of reckoning. Who's still here, and what did it cost? Rivers, once frozen highways, became boundaries again. Streams burst their banks, swallowing paths and caches, erasing landmarks the way winter had erased footprints. The same water that killed thirst now drowned storage pits and flooded low camps. Survival required a kind of creative pessimism. Every blessing doubled as a hazard. And yet, spring also brought small, indecent beauty. Grass poking through ash, the first crow daring to shout at the sky, children stumbling outside, amazed to remember color. The world thawed unevenly, like a half-forgiven argument. The people thawed slower. Their laughter came back last. The dead were handled gently, not with grief, but with conversation. He walked too far, someone might say, or she forgot the wind shifts early here. It wasn't cruelty, it was education. Each loss was folded into the collective memory, stored for next year's children. On that open land, the dead never really left. They became footnotes in a map of survival. When the last drifts shrank to puddles, hunters tested the ground, women cleaned the hides, and the elders marked the year's story, painted symbols onto a stretched buffalo skin. The blizzard that buried the river, the wolf tracks that led to food, the family that vanished quietly but taught everyone else a new rule. These were the winter counts, the ledgers of existence. By the time the grass turned fully green, the people were already preparing again. Because spring wasn't reprieve, it was the start of another countdown. Summer meant hunts, harvests, trade, all the frantic prelude to the next freeze. Life here was circular, not linear. You didn't escape winter, you just bought more time before it remembered you. Still, there was a strange peace in that repetition. The snow would always come back, the wind would always test the walls, and people, stubborn, funny, endlessly adjusting, would always answer. Because the secret of survival in a land that tried so hard to kill you wasn't strength, or faith, or luck. It was the quiet understanding that endurance itself is a kind of culture, one written not in books, but in footprints that vanish, season after season, into melting snow. Heat, as it turns out, is overrated. The earliest humans learned that lesson somewhere between the mammoth steppe and the edge of an ice sheet. When the wood ran out, the wind stopped negotiating, and fire became a rumor. Out there, warmth wasn't something you made, it was something you kept from leaving. The trick wasn't to chase heat, but to trap what little already existed. Archaeologists like to praise the mastery of fire, but what really deserves applause is the moment humanity realized that smoke and flesh could do most of the work if you were clever enough. Caves were nice, sure, but temporary. What mattered was insulation, air that stayed still, hides that sealed, and bodies that behaved like radiators with opinions. The first shelters were not triumphs of architecture. They were desperate equations. How much skin, fur, and patience does it take to stop freezing to death tonight? Fire wasn't dependable. You could run out of fuel, or oxygen, or time. In places where trees existed only as rumors, the Eurasian tundra, the high Arctic, the northern plains, people found other ways to cheat the cold. They built smaller spaces, not grander ones. They dug into earth, packed snow, leaned mammoth bones into frames, and then did something revolutionary. They closed the door. The warmth they created wasn't from flame but from presence, layers of hides, trapped air, shared breath. You could almost call it accidental physics. When enough bodies stayed still in a small enough space, the temperature rose just enough to fool death into waiting. It was warmth without combustion, a system so efficient that even modern thermal engineers begrudgingly admire it. Inside these makeshift dens, light came from oil lamps or embers, but heat came from life itself. The walls absorbed it, the hides contained it, and the air turned thick and smoky, equal parts comfort and carbon dioxide. Breathing became a communal effort. It wasn't romantic, more like mildly organized suffocation. But it worked. And then there was smoke, the accidental savior. Too much of it killed you slowly. Just enough turned the ceiling into insulation. It coated everything, walls, skin, lungs, with a black film that trapped both heat and memory. The smell was everywhere, clinging to hides and hair, to the babies and the dogs, and the bones left drying by the fire. It was disgusting, but it meant you were alive. The shift from fuel to body, from bonfire to breath, was more than adaptation, it was a philosophy. It redefined the relationship between humans and air, warmth as cooperation, not domination. Every exhale was recycled, every inhale was borrowed. The environment wasn't conquered, it was negotiated with. And once that fragile pocket of survival was achieved, that tiny balance between warmth and suffocation, people started to refine it. They learned how to build walls that breathed, roofs that sweated, and entrances that tricked the wind. They created not just shelter, but atmosphere. Because eventually, insulation became architecture, a craft of layers and logic that understood heat better than fire ever could. A good shelter, in the old sense of the word, wasn't a house, it was a controlled collapse. Everything about it was temporary, except the logic. The goal wasn't to build something strong, it was to build something that stayed warm long enough to matter. And so, across centuries and continents, people perfected the architecture of barely surviving. You can see the same idea reappearing everywhere, from the icy tundra to the wind-swept steppes. Small, low, tight, and vaguely suffocating. The physics were universal. Warmth doesn't care about aesthetics, it only respects surface area. The less space between you and your neighbor, the less opportunity for heat to escape and humidity to enter. Nomads built hide tents, so conical they looked like smoke made solid. Northern families dug half-buried dwellings, sod walls, packed snow, even mammoth bones stacked into crude ribs of shelter. In each version, the materials changed, but the principle stayed the same: hold the air hostage. Air, once trapped, behaves like a shy animal. It stops moving, and therefore, it stays warm. Anthropologists have excavated Ice Age shelters so compact that a family of 5 could have shared a space smaller than a modern bathroom. The bones of their fires are barely the size of a loaf of bread. Those flames didn't heat the air, they heated the story. Warmth was borrowed, recycled, and rebreathed. A cave wasn't cozy because of stone. It was cozy because 10 lungs agreed to cooperate. Even the entrances were works of environmental psychology. Doorways faced away from prevailing winds, dug downward or covered by hanging hides. A little cold air always got in, enough to remind everyone how clever the builders were. Windbreaks made of sod or snow curved like the body of the earth itself, absorbing the violence of the weather before it reached the living. There's beauty in how unheroic this architecture was. No one built monuments to it. The walls sagged, the roofs leaked, and the floors froze nightly. Yet these shelters represented the first true human interiors. The idea that space could be crafted to manipulate temperature, sound, and air. It was the beginning of controlled climate, not through machinery, but through geometry and nerve. Inside, it was dark, smoky, and crowded. You could hear breathing before you saw faces. The hides rustled when someone turned over in sleep, and the snow outside muted every sound except the occasional crack of frost-splitting wood. If there was peace, it wasn't comfortable, it was strategic. Modern architects still talk about thermal efficiency, unaware that it was perfected somewhere around 20,000 BCE by people with no blueprints, just intuition and the will not to die. They understood that warmth wasn't a temperature, it was a layout, and where the walls ended, the air changed. That thin line between inside and out became the true invention, the creation of atmosphere itself, one breath at a time. But air, when it refused to leave, brought a new companion with it, something irritating, blinding, and surprisingly useful: smoke. To modern sensibilities, smoke is a nuisance, a sign that something's malfunctioning. To the people who lived in small, sealed worlds of hide and frost, it was a kind of collaborator. The same haze that stung eyes and painted lungs in soot also kept meat from rotting, hides from molding, and insects from pretending they ran the place. What modern engineers would call a design flaw, early humans called breathing. A fire was never just a flame. It was a factory of light, heat, odor, and smoke. The smoke did what walls couldn't. It filled cracks, sealed seams, and lined ceilings with a tar-like varnish that turned the shelter itself into insulation. Every exhale of that reluctant cloud added another layer of defense. The price was irritation, coughing, and permanent perfume. But in the grand accounting of survival, that was a bargain. There's a reason so many prehistoric dwellings were black inside. From Arctic huts to Siberian pits, the carbon coating trapped heat, repelled moisture, and preserved the structure longer than any paint could dream of. The same physics that ruins modern apartments saved Ice Age families. Smoke was their spray foam insulation, their antibacterial air freshener, and their house blessing all at once. It was also memory. Generations lived under the same layer of soot, inhaling the history of those who came before. Archaeologists now read those smoke stains like tree rings, a timeline of occupation layered in carbon and fat. Each season added a darker hue, each family a slightly different recipe of fuel. If you could decode the chemistry of the ceiling, you could read a biography of hunger and adaptation. The smoke itself carried its own rituals. Too much, and you opened the flap to bargain with the wind. Too little, and mosquitoes invaded, or hides soured, or spirits, whichever word you preferred, got restless. The air had to be right, which meant dense enough to sting but not to kill. Some cultures even placed herbs in the fire, turning the irritation into ceremony. Sage, spruce, juniper, disinfectant wrapped in theology. And then there was the smell. Everything smelled like smoke. the people, the food, the tools, the bedding. It was impossible to separate the living from their environment because they all shared the same scent. Visitors could identify a camp from miles away, following the ghost of wood and fat drifting over snow. It was the ancient equivalent of a postal address. Scientists today call this kind of exposure toxic. And they're right. Life expectancy dropped, lungs blackened, eyes clouded early. But that's the quiet hypocrisy of comfort talking, because without that toxicity, there would have been no survival to study. The smoke was not a problem to solve. It was proof that life had negotiated a truce with physics. Fire was never clean. It was clever. And under that oily ceiling of haze and breath, another material miracle was at work. Soft, flexible, and equally alive. The hides that turned air into walls. Before bricks, before wool, before anyone thought to name a season, there were hides, the first material that let humans pretend they were smarter than the weather. Every scrap of fur stretched between two poles was a small, defiant experiment in applied biology. How to borrow an animal's engineering and hope the cold doesn't notice the difference. A hide wasn't just dead skin. It was a survival algorithm. Buffalo, reindeer, seal, elk, each came with its own user manual written in texture. Fern hides were for deep cold. Fernhof hides lined walls or floors. Oil-soaked ones became windbreaks. You could build an entire household from the remains of one well-chosen beast. Anthropologists later called it material culture. The people who lived it called it Tuesday. Tanning was less of a craft and more of an intimate act of chemistry. Brains were used to soften the skin. Yes, actual brains, because the same fatty acids that powered thought also made leather supple. Smoke finished the job, sealing pores and waterproofing the surface in a slow, fragrant cloud of practicality. Every lodge, every pair of leggings, every sleeping robe was the result of someone's genius in reverse engineering anatomy. Women were the master technicians of this quiet science. Their hands learned to read texture the way others read weather, by feel. They knew when a hide had been scraped enough, when it was too wet, too stiff, too proud. Their labor didn't just produce warmth, it produced the walls, bedding, tools, and even the ropes that held the shelters together. The survival of entire communities hung, quite literally, on their patience with sinew and bone scrapers. Once prepared, the hides performed like living insulation. When sewn into tipis or draped over frames of wood and bone, they formed airtight shells that flexed with the wind instead of fighting it. The animals had already solved aerodynamics. Humans just followed their lead. Inside, the hides breathed, letting moisture escape while trapping body heat. If architecture is the art of temperature, this was its original masterpiece. Even clothing was architecture on a smaller scale. Multiple layers, each performing a task. One to wick, one to trap, one to repel. The earliest jackets were less fashion statements and more arguments against hypothermia. Stitching wasn't decorative, it was literal life support. And the threads weren't thread at all, but sinew, self-tightening cords of muscle that contracted when wet, making each seam both watertight and self-correcting. You can't patent that. The hides carried memory. Over time, they absorbed smoke, oils, breath, and blood, the signature scent of existence. Every family had its own olfactory fingerprint, a blend of species and effort. Visitors didn't knock, they smelled where they were. Modern humans have thermostats and insulation ratings. Their ancestors had odor as ancestry. To live surrounded by hides was to live in a constant state of closeness to the animals, the air, and one another. Which of course led to the next great discovery, that sometimes the best source of heat wasn't the fire, or the hides, or even the architecture. It was the people themselves, breathing quietly into the same confined space. Warmth, in its most primitive form, was social. Long before anyone invented insulation or heating, people discovered that the human body itself was a kind of low-maintenance furnace, one that didn't require fuel, only company. The cold taught that lesson early and often. Solitude froze faster than arrogance, and every night became an exercise in cooperative physics. Sleeping arrangements were never random. Families, travelers, and strangers alike lay in deliberate configurations, backs aligned, limbs overlapping, faces turned toward shared breath. It wasn't affection, it was engineering. Body heat radiates outward, but most of it escapes from the head and chest. So the clever ones slept nose to neck, chest to spine, stacking warmth in layers of slow-moving breath. In the language of survival, intimacy had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with thermodynamics. The air inside these dwellings was heavy, thick with smoke, sweat, and carbon dioxide. It didn't circulate much, and that was the point. The staler it got, the warmer it stayed. Scientists now talk about passive heating systems. They were invented accidentally, by people huddled so close together they could count each other's heartbeats through the hides. Children and elders were placed in the center, not out of sentimentality, but because that's where the temperature gradient peaked. Dogs were the unofficial outer insulation, curled at the edges of sleeping spaces like living fur blankets. There's an old anthropological phrase, three-dog night, and it isn't metaphor, it's measurement. Privacy, that fragile modern obsession, didn't exist in these conditions. Neither did personal space. Breath mixed with breath, until everyone shared the same invisible rhythm. Even dreams felt communal, shaped by the sounds of neighbors shifting beside you, the muffled snore of a dog, the occasional cough swallowed by the smoke. If there was warmth, it belonged to everyone. The system was brutally efficient. Each human produced roughly 100 watts of heat. Multiply that by 10 people. Add a single low fire, and you had enough warmth to turn an ice cave into a livable space. No one did the math consciously, but the results were there. Fewer deaths, longer nights, a sense of safety masquerading as comfort. There's a kind of humility in that arrangement, the understanding that survival isn't an individual sport. Warmth was something negotiated through proximity, a fragile pact between bodies. You didn't hoard it, because hoarding heat was impossible. It escaped anyway, and the only way to keep it from vanishing was to share it. The irony is that the closer people drew together, the more the air changed. Every exhale thickened it, made it heavier, more alive. Over time, that breath recycled, warmed, exhaled again, became part of the architecture itself. It clung to hides, condensed on ceilings, and dripped down as a reminder that even air has memory. And in that strange, enclosed atmosphere, warmth wasn't just something people created. It became something they lived inside of, their breath turning into weather, their voices into temperature. Which leads to the quietest miracle of all, the way breath itself became a kind of atmosphere, invisible, rhythmic, and shared. Inside those dim enclosures, breath wasn't just something you did, it was something you lived inside. The air was dense, slow, and full of evidence that people existed there. Vapor rising, settling, merging. Every inhalation carried a little of everyone else. The child asleep by the wall, the old woman tending the coals, the dogs dreaming under the hides. It was collective respiration, the most literal version of community possible. The atmosphere had a sound to it, a kind of low, steady hum, the creak of hides, the crackle of fire, the muffled chorus of human lungs working in unison. Step inside from the cold and you could hear the air before you felt it, thick, wet, and warm in the way that comes only from living things. Anthropologists, with their fondness for sterile phrasing, call this microclimatic modification. The people inside just called it life. Shared breath was both blessing and hazard. In the right balance, it kept the air warm enough to prevent frostbite. Push it too far, and the carbon dioxide thickened until everyone began dreaming of open skies. People learned to manage it intuitively, opening a flap just long enough to let the cold bite, then closing it again before the warmth fled. You could tell a good firekeeper not by how bright the flames burned, but by how breathable the air still felt at dawn. There was poetry in the physics. Warm air rose, condensed against the hides, and fell again in slow drips, rain made of breath. Each drop carried the essence of the people who'd been inside too long. Smoke, fat, sleep, and story. The walls themselves absorbed it, darkening over time into a soft, oily sheen that archaeologists now mistake for dirt. It wasn't filth, it was residue of existence. Rituals grew around this invisible exchange. Singing, chanting, storytelling, all of them shaped air. Rhythmic voices stirred the air just enough to circulate heat, to break the monotony of stillness. It wasn't superstition, it was thermal management with better acoustics. A house without voices froze faster. The hush of silence was never comfort, it was warning. Even spiritually, breath carried weight. In many old traditions, breath was life itself, the animating force, the spirit, the proof of presence. In those enclosed spaces, that idea wasn't metaphor. To breathe together was to exist together. If someone's breath stopped, the atmosphere changed immediately. Everyone felt it. The smell, of course, was unforgettable. The combination of hides, smoke, sweat, and sleep that marked every winter dwelling. Outsiders would have called it unbearable. Insiders would have called it home. The scent of shared breath was the signature of belonging, the invisible boundary between safety and frost. And in that space of recycled air and quiet labor, something shifted. Warmth stopped being an external condition and became an interior state. Not fire, not shelter, but the act of simply being alive together. When people stepped out into the white silence again, the air outside felt foreign, too clean, too empty, but they always returned, back to the dim, smoky heart of the dwelling, where warmth floated unseen in every breath. And there, under that soft glow of embers, fire itself took on a new role, less as heat, more as presence, a small sun around which everything human revolved. The fire in those cramped shelters was never the roaring kind. It didn't leap or blaze or perform. It smoldered, sighed, and waited, a small, obedient thing. Its job wasn't to heat the space, because it couldn't. A big fire would have devoured the oxygen and smoked everyone out before breakfast. So instead, the flame learned humility. It became not warmth, but witness. At night, when the cold pressed against the walls like a living creature, the fire stayed small and serious, its light flickering against the hides in a rhythm that seemed deliberate. Shadows breathed on the ceiling. Every movement near the flame looked sacred by accident, hands turning meat, a woman scraping a hide, a man sharpening a bone blade, all transformed into rituals simply because the light made them important. Fire gave meaning to motion, and it wasn't about heat, it was about time. The fire was the clock, the heartbeat, the entertainment. It marked the slow disintegration of night into morning by the collapse of its embers. You could tell how long someone had been talking by how far the flame had shrunk. When it hissed and dimmed, conversations ended. When it sparked unexpectedly, laughter followed, as if the fire itself had joined in. People stared into it, not because it was pretty, but because it was company. It moved when everything else stood still. The glow softened faces, smoothed age, hid exhaustion. It turned strangers into silhouettes, sharing the same mystery. In a world without glass or mirrors, this was the only reflection people had, flickering, fragmented, and honest. The fire also played psychologist. It absorbed secrets, swallowed arguments, and gave nothing back but smoke. People whispered to it when others slept, confessed their weariness or fear, watched the sparks rise like prayers with no direction. There was comfort in knowing that something else was awake in the dark, even if it was just a controlled chemical reaction pretending to be a friend. Every household had its own flame, lit from an older one, carried forward through migrations or seasons. Extinguishing it by mistake wasn't a small inconvenience. It was a moral failure. To lose your fire was to lose continuity, the physical thread that tied you to every ancestor who had ever shivered under the same stars. And the smell of it, the sweet oily temps of burning fat or the sharper resin of spruce, became a scent memory that followed people everywhere. It lingered on their clothes, their tools, their hair, marking them as part of a specific interior world. You could tell where someone had spent the night by the way they smelled in the morning. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about these flames is that they made people stop moving. For a species addicted to motion, to hunting, gathering, wandering, sitting still beside a fire was an evolutionary miracle. It created the first evenings, the first pauses, the first chance to imagine something beyond hunger. And in that soft orange light, amid the hiss of sap and the hum of shared breath, warmth began to change shape. It wasn't a number on a scale anymore. It was a relationship between flame, air, body, and story. Even the smoke, rising lazily toward the roof, seemed to carry a piece of that understanding with it. That identity and atmosphere was starting to smell the same. Nothing human smelled then. Clean was for the dead, the river stones, and maybe the gods on a polite day. The living smelled like smoke, like hides, like the long argument between cold and endurance. And that wasn't a problem, it was a passport. The scent of a household was its fingerprint, its invisible border. Step inside the wrong shelter and the air itself would reject you. The odor wasn't random, it was layered. There was the bass note of burned fat, the middle tone of tanned hide, and the high, sharp accent of sweat turned metallic from days without washing. Together they made something oddly recognizable, the smell of life trying not to end. You could call it perfume by necessity, an aroma that said, "We're still here, barely, and that counts for something." To outsiders, later settlers, traders, missionaries, it was unbearable. They wrote about it in journals, with a mix of disgust and fascination, describing interiors so thick with scent they could be cut. What they didn't understand was that this density wasn't filth, it was survival turned tangible. Those same smoke-saturated hides repelled moisture, masked the stench of meat storage, and warded off insects. Odor was insulation, in both a physical and social sense. Inside the shelter, the smell mapped time. Fresh hides smelled sharp and nervous. Old ones had mellowed into something close to sweetness. You could tell which families had just arrived from the hunt and which had stayed through the long winter without moving. The air was a diary no one wrote, only inhaled. And in a way, the smell told truth better than words. It revealed who shared breath with whom, what had been burned, who had eaten well, and who hadn't eaten at all. If the air smelled too clean, too fresh, it was suspicious. It meant emptiness, or death, or abandonment. A living home was supposed to reek a little. Anthropologists sometimes refer to this as an olfactory identity, but that phrase is too sterile. The reality was biological intimacy, every wall, tool, and body swapping particles until individuality dissolved into the collective. It was chemical kinship, the scent equivalent of a last name. The odor clung to the skin, of course. People carried it into the open air, and the wind would catch it, trail it, announce their return before their voices could. Hunters could smell their own camp long before it appeared on the horizon, a warm, smoky promise that the cold hadn't won yet. Even religion found a use for this invisible presence. The smell of smoke was proof that something sacred had happened, a ritual, a meal, a life continuing. It linked the human and the divine through the most democratic of mediums, air. And so, over generations, people stopped noticing the scent altogether. It became background, like heartbeat or gravity. Only when the shelters emptied in spring did they realize the air outside smelled like nothing at all. Cold, sterile, hollow. A world without smoke felt uninhabited. But that invisible inheritance, that fusion of odor, breath, and memory, outlasted even the structures themselves. Because long before heat came from wires or vents, it came from relationships, between people, air, and what lingered between them. And those relationships, as fragile as they seemed, built the first moral system around warmth itself, a code that governed how you shared it, with whom, and when. Warmth was never a private matter. In the cold, heat was a currency that couldn't be hoarded. It leaked, escaped, clung to the nearest body, then drifted away again, a perfect socialist. The only way to keep it was to share it. Every culture that lived with real cold learned this unspoken rule. Generosity wasn't moral virtue, it was thermodynamics. Hospitality, for example, wasn't born from kindness, it was born from temperature. To let someone freeze outside was to waste potential heat. To bring them in was to invest it. A stranger entering a winter shelter didn't just bring danger or gossip, they brought energy, literal wattage in human form. Each breath they exhaled raised the ambient temperature a fraction of a degree. In this economy, warmth was the only real wealth. That's why the act of inviting someone close to a fire, to a bed, to a shared meal, carried more gravity than any spoken oath. You weren't offering comfort, you were merging ecosystems. To feed someone meant to warm them. To warm them meant to survive together. It was the simplest and most sacred exchange in human history. Even conflict paused for heat. Enemies might share a fire before returning to hostility in daylight. There are old Arctic stories of hunters finding stranded travelers from rival clans and wordlessly sheltering them until the weather turned. Killing in the cold was wasteful. Survival required collaboration, if only temporarily. Nature imposed a kind of moral ceiling. No one could afford cruelty for long. Within families, warmth shaped hierarchy. The youngest and oldest took the center spots by the fire. Adults formed the perimeter. Children learned early that warmth came through others, not in spite of them. Affection and temperature became interchangeable. Love wasn't declared. It was demonstrated through how much heat you gave up. There were rules, too. Refusing to share warmth, refusing to make space, hoard fuel, or sleep apart, was considered a form of arrogance, almost taboo. The worst insult you could give someone wasn't cold-hearted, it was cold alone. Those who isolated themselves didn't last long, physically or socially. As the seasons passed, warmth became the language of social cohesion. Marriages were described in terms of shared shelter, alliances sealed with blankets, reconciliations with communal fires. There was no separation between the emotional and the elemental. Both could kill you if neglected. Even now, the remnants of that logic survive in language, heating up in conversation, cold shoulders, warm welcomes. The metaphors are fossils of an older truth, that intimacy began as climate control. And when the old ways faded, when fuel replaced breath and solitude became possible, something subtle went missing. People learned to survive without one another, but they forgot how to stay warm together. The modern home has plenty of heat, but it rarely has temperature that feels shared. Back then, warmth wasn't comfort, it was a covenant, a silent agreement that every exhale mattered, that to be alive meant to contribute, that heat itself was proof of belonging. And when the fire died and everyone slept under the same smoke-dark roof, that belonging became memory, not just of weather, but of what it meant to be human. Because in the end, even the most primitive form of warmth leaves traces in soot, in breath, in scent, and eventually in nostalgia, the ghost of heat that memory gives off when the real thing is gone. When the shelters collapsed in spring and the people moved on, warmth didn't disappear. It lingered, faint and invisible, like an echo in the air. The ashes were cold, the hides stiff, but the space still remembered. The soot-lined walls held a residual hum of human presence, as if the air itself had been taught what living felt like and hadn't quite forgotten. Archaeologists call these traces occupation layers. What they really are is the sediment of warmth, smoke, particles fused with fat and breath, buried under centuries of indifference. Scrape away the soil, and you can still smell it, that mix of ash, animal, and exhalation, the perfume of endurance. It's proof that heat once had a shape. The memory of heat-shaped myth, too. Across northern cultures, the afterlife was rarely imagined as fiery. Heaven was described as temperate, not hot, a place where you were finally warm enough without crowding anyone else. Hell, on the other hand, wasn't always fire. Sometimes it was freezing wind, endless hunger, and the absence of shared breath. To suffer wasn't to burn, it was to be cold alone. Even architecture carried that memory forward. The first permanent houses, mud, timber, later stone, mimicked the old winter lodges in proportion. Low ceilings, narrow entrances, enclosed hearths. Civilization didn't outgrow the cold. It memorialized it in every room designed to trap warmth. Each wall was an act of nostalgia for the smoky dens that taught people how to survive together. When we build today, we still chase that feeling: insulation, heating, double glazing, a modern rephrasing of hides, smoke, and breath. The difference is that now the warmth is silent. It hums from radiators, glows from wires. It doesn't smell like anything, doesn't ask for anyone's cooperation. Comfort has become solitary. The air doesn't know who you are anymore. In the old shelters, heat had personality. It flickered, shifted, sometimes sulked. You had to tend it, talk to it, feed it. It was an animal, moody, forgiving, alive, forgetting that relationship was the price of progress. We gained convenience, but lost the conversation. Still, the memory of that warmth clings to us. It lives in rituals we barely notice, the instinct to gather around light, to cook near others, to talk until the room feels smaller and the air softer. Even in our modern, sterile comfort, we simulate it. Candles, fireplaces, electric flames that pretend to need us. Maybe what we miss isn't fire, but reciprocity. The memory of heat is older than language. It's written in the body, the way shoulders lean toward one another in cold rooms, the way silence feels heavier when it's dark, the way warmth feels most real when it's shared. We've forgotten the physics, but not the feeling. And so the story ends the way it began, with smoke, hides, and breath, the earliest architecture of survival. The first lesson humanity ever learned from the cold was not how to build fires, but how to build closeness. Because in the end, what kept them alive wasn't heat at all. It was everything that made heat possible. The first real enemy humanity ever met didn't roar or bleed or chase, it just waited. It came in silence, without a face, without intention, and it killed more efficiently than any predator. The cold didn't need claws, it had time. Somewhere around 30,000 years ago, people began wandering north into a landscape that had no interest in accommodating them, where breath turned visible and trees cracked like bone. That was the beginning of the longest argument in human history, not with gods, not with each other, but with temperature. The Ice Age wasn't a single frozen moment. It was an ongoing conversation between Earth and arrogance. Step too far from the fire, and the conversation ended. The cold taught early people about limits, the first subject in nature's curriculum. They learned the physics of failure quickly, that the air could take more from you than hunger ever could. Firelight was no longer comfort, it was confession. Each spark said, "We weren't built for this," and each flame whispered back, "Then learn." The first shelters were acts of apology. Mammoth bones, sod, snow, whatever came to hand was turned into proof that defiance could be practical. The cold didn't punish recklessness directly. It just waited for a mistake. Drop your guard, misjudge a storm, forget to seal a seam, and it would quietly reclaim what warmth you'd borrowed. Every survivor was a scholar of small details. How to walk on frozen ground without sweating, how to breathe without icing your own lungs, how to tell the difference between a friendly wind and one that meant extinction. And yet, the cold didn't just take, it refined attention. In the tropics, a person could afford to be lazy. In the tundra, distraction was suicide. Out there, intelligence stopped being theoretical. It became Skenevel. A misstep wasn't a metaphor, it was an obituary. The cold carved precision into people's habits. It forced invention, the sewing needle, the layered hide, the concept of insulation, all born not from curiosity, but from sheer desperation. Necessity may be the mother of invention, but cold was its midwife, cutting the cord with a shard of ice. The relationship wasn't purely hostile, though there was respect. The cold wasn't evil, it was indifferent. It didn't hunt or hate, it tested. And in that test, humanity became something new, the animal that could manipulate air. They learned to trap heat, to make wind behave, to turn breath itself into a resource. The cold forced humans to understand physics before they had a word for it, to study the invisible until it obeyed. Archaeologists like to romanticize migration as exploration, but most of it was stubbornness with frostbite. People followed the herds, followed the seasons, followed hunger into places that froze their eyelashes shut, and stayed. They didn't conquer the cold, they negotiated with it. Every fire lit in the open tundra was a peace treaty written in smoke, and as generations passed, the lessons deepened. The cold began shaping bodies, shorter limbs, thicker torsos, slower metabolism, biology learning the same lessons culture did. The environment started leaving fingerprints in the bone. The cold wasn't just outside anymore, it lived under the skin. But even adaptation has a limit. When the ice retreated and humans followed, they carried those lessons with them, not in words, but in habits. The reflex to gather close, the instinct to share heat, the quiet suspicion of wind, all souvenirs from the first time the Earth decided to turn the temperature down and see who was paying attention. And yet, what the cold began as threat, it perfected as teacher, teaching geography not through maps, but through muscle memory. Because the next great lesson was still ahead. That cold didn't just shape people's bones, it shaped where they could exist at all. Cold doesn't have borders, but it creates them. It decides where forests end, where rivers sleep, and where people stop pretending they're in charge. When the Ice Age tightened its grip, the planet rearranged itself into zones of possibility and punishment. South of the glaciers, you could still find grass, herds, and arrogance. North of them, there was only education. Every step toward the poles was a step into fewer options. Trees vanished first, replaced by frozen scrub and stubborn lichens that looked like the Earth's dandruff. Game animals grew massive, slow, and heavily insulated, as if they'd been designed by a committee of desperate gods. The landscape became geometry, white, flat, and mercilessly honest. Nothing decorative survived there. In that pale emptiness, humans began to specialize. Bodies shortened, torsos thickened, fingers learned efficiency over grace, faces widened to trap air and keep it warm before it reached the lungs. It wasn't evolution as grandeur. It was evolution as improvisation. The environment didn't reward beauty, it rewarded balance, compactness, and the ability to find calories hidden under snow. The cold rearranged time, took seasons shrank into two moods, starvation and preparation. The sun, when it appeared, became the year's only celebrity. Its brief visits celebrated like miracles. People learned to count its absences, to predict its faint return. The calendar wasn't a cultural invention. It was a form of anxiety management. Food became geography in miniature. In frozen places, a meal meant migration, patience, or risk. Hunters followed herds across featureless ice, tracking warmth by proxy. Meat froze solid in minutes, which meant every kill doubled as refrigeration. Fat became currency, the only edible source of fire. The stomach replaced the map. Even distance changed meaning. A valley wasn't a valley, it was a wind trap. A mountain wasn't scenic, it was death by shadow. The terrain taught observation so intense it bordered on paranoia. You learned to read the snow, how it drifted, how it broke underfoot, how it glittered differently before storms. Navigation wasn't about landmarks, it was about texture and sound. The people who thrived here didn't see the land as barren. They saw it as precise. Every object had a function, every breath an equation. The horizon might look empty to the untrained eye, but to those who'd lived there long enough, it was full of quiet instructions. The cold was a teacher with strict grading policies. Fail to notice, fail to exist. Even culture adjusted its expectations. Songs grew shorter, rhythms slower. You didn't waste breath on poetry when the air bit back. Language itself changed, adopting words for shades of ice, kinds of wind, qualities of stillness. Survival demanded vocabulary, not vanity. And yet, within that restraint, a new kind of imagination bloomed. When everything around you froze, your mind had to move faster to compensate. The cold sculpted the intellect as much as the body. It built patience, calculation, the long-term memory of climate. Eventually, geography stopped being a backdrop and became a collaborator. The ice dictated the rules. Humans wrote the footnotes. And in those footnotes, they discovered something unexpected, that the stillness enforced by cold wasn't punishment at all. It was opportunity. Because in a world where movement meant death, thought became the new form of travel. Cold has a way of slowing everything down, until only the essential remains. Movement wastes heat, talk wastes air, and panic wastes both. The great invention of frozen humanity wasn't fire or fur or shelter. It was patience. Stillness wasn't weakness. It was strategy. When the wind howled and the world froze solid, the only thing that made sense was to stop trying to outpace it and start learning from it. Archaeologists call it seasonal settlement. What it really was surrender, with style. Groups stopped wandering and began folding themselves into the landscape, burrowing into snow, mud, or stone, waiting out the months like hibernating minds. The body might rest, but the imagination did lapse. That's the thing about stillness. It leaves the brain unsupervised. Inside those dark, airtight spaces, people invented everything that couldn't exist in motion. Tools became refined, stories became structured, and language, that strange art of turning air into cooperation, developed under the pressure of boredom. When you can't hunt, you narrate. When you can't see the horizon, you start describing it. The cold invented not just endurance but reflection. The silence outside was absolute. The snow swallowed sound so completely that even breathing felt loud. Inside, whispers replaced speech. A single cough could echo like thunder. It's no wonder spirituality flourished here. Isolation sharpens attention until ordinary things start looking divine. The faint crackle of a dying ember, the drip of thawing ice, the rhythm of shared breathing, all of it began to feel like communication with something larger, older, and distinctly unimpressed. Stillness also taught humans to see time differently. When the cold forced life to pause, progress stopped being about distance and started being about duration. The longest-lasting flame, the most enduring hide, the most persistent story, these became the true measures of success. The cold made time viscous. Every hour stretched, every day folded in on itself, until existence became less about what's next and more about what's left. It was in these pauses that art was born. Carvings, beads, cave paintings, the first recorded signs of introspection, all appeared in cultures forced indoors by climate. When nature pressed the pause button, the human mind filled the silence with symbols. You could almost say the cold invented abstraction by accident. But there was danger too. Too much stillness made the mind unravel. In the endless dark, Days became interchangeable. Sleep and waking blurred into one. The line between memory and imagination thinned. To survive, people had to create rhythm, ritual, song, anything that imitated the pulse of movement while the world held its breath. The cold didn't just shape bodies and tools, it choreographed behavior. And when the thaw came, when the rivers cracked open and light returned, those long hours of enforced reflection spilled outward. People emerged, leaner, quieter, and sharper, carrying new songs, new tools, and an updated sense of the invisible. Because after spending months staring into the white nothing, they'd learned a truth no summer ever teaches. Silence is never empty, it listens back. And once you've heard that kind of silence, it's impossible to forget how small you are in it. Which is precisely when the cold began teaching its next lesson, that fear, in moderation, is the most reliable form of intelligence. The first sound you stop trusting in the cold is your own breath. It fogs the air, marks your location, reminds you that you're burning fuel too quickly. The white silence out there wasn't peaceful. It was judgmental. It watched. When the wind fell still, the world didn't feel safe. It felt like it was waiting to erase you politely. Fear, in that kind of quiet, wasn't emotion. It was awareness sharpened to a blade. The tundra and the steppe didn't tolerate confidence. You learned to read moods in wind, to flinch before the snow shifted. Survival depended on the fine art of worrying early. Every movement, every crack in the ice, every change in the tone of silence carried information. The anxious lived longer. The long winters taught humans to fear in cycles. Night wasn't just darkness, it was disappearance. When the sun vanished for weeks or months, entire communities had to relearn what hope sounded like. In those hours, imagination became both salvation and liability. The mind filled the dark with eyes, spirits, ancestors, things that whispered from the snowdrifts. The first myths of frost demons and sky hunters weren't superstition. They were the nervous system writing poetry. Even today, you can trace that ancestry of unease. The stories of ghosts that freeze you where you stand, of voices in blizzards, of pale figures at the edge of sight, all born from the sensory deprivation of endless white. The cold stripped away color, scent, and sound until the only thing left to sense was yourself, and even that felt unreliable. Inside the shelters, fear had its own architecture. People slept lightly, listening for the wrong kind of quiet, the silence that meant the fire had died. Children were told that if they disrespected the cold, it would come for them personally. Fear was domesticated into discipline, turned into education. You didn't outgrow it, you inherited it. The old shamans, though they weren't called that yet, understood the psychology perfectly. They ritualized anxiety into religion. When people feared the cold, they called it spirit. When they feared the dark, they called it presence. The unknown was given manners. You couldn't conquer the environment, but you could apologize to it. Fear became etiquette, and the etiquette worked. Fear kept the fires fed, the hides sealed, the communities close. It bred humility, a practical kind, not the moral variety. The cold didn't care if you were brave, but it rewarded those who acted like it was dangerous. Courage was tolerated, caution was promoted. Over generations, this instinct calcified into culture. Songs warned against wandering too far. Tools were designed for efficiency, not pride. Every successful adaptation carried a trace of dread, the unspoken understanding that everything outside the circle of warmth still wanted you gone. But fear wasn't only a warning system, it was a teacher of attention. It forced people to notice subtleties, how smoke rose, how snow compacted underfoot, how a faint draft signaled a flaw in the wall. To be afraid was to be awake. The frozen world rewarded that state of permanent alertness, sculpting minds as carefully as it did bodies. And once people learned to live with fear instead of under it, they discovered something remarkable. The cold hadn't been trying to kill them, it had been training them to listen, to prepare, to cooperate. Which is why the next lesson it offered wasn't about dread at all. It was about generosity, and how sharing heat became humanity's first moral act. Heat was the first currency that ever mattered. Long before metal, before trade routes or written ledgers, warmth was the resource everyone understood. It was finite, measurable, and brutally democratic. You couldn't fake it. Either you had it, or you didn't, and if you didn't, someone shared it, or you were gone by morning. Every campfire was an economy in miniature. The fire itself sat at the center, surrounded by a hierarchy of bodies, children and elders nearest, hunters and guests on the edge. Distribution wasn't symbolic. It was thermodynamic justice. The closer you were, the more you lived. Generosity wasn't a moral choice. It was physics with manners. Fuel, though, was the hard part. Wood was precious in treeless lands. Dung, bone, and fat became its substitutes. A handful of dried grass, or a fragment of grease, meant an hour of survival. Keeping the flame alive was everyone's business. If it went out, there was no blame, only consequence. The entire group's pulse dropped with it. What fascinates archaeologists now is how quickly warmth became social glue. The need to share fire turned cooperation into instinct. People learned to build tight circles, to rotate positions, to take turns tending the coals. Sitting together became a survival structure. Even now, when people gather by light, campfires, candles, screens, they unconsciously rebuild that circle, repeating a gesture 40,000 years old. Warmth also taught humanity its first laws of exchange. To receive shelter meant to owe labor. To share breath meant to return loyalty. Guests were fed not out of charity, but as a kind of insurance policy. You warmed someone today so they'd remember you tomorrow. The earliest form of diplomacy was probably a well-tended fire. And yet, like all economies, warmth had its hoarders. Those who built fires too large or too often, who burned too much fuel, were quietly distrusted. Waste was dangerous. It risked imbalance. The real virtue was moderation, knowing how much flame a night required and how little ego it could sustain. Modesty, as it turns out, began as energy efficiency. There was poetry in the logistics. A family's health could be heard in the pitch of their fire, seen in the color of its smoke. Blue meant clean burn. Yellow meant damp wood or desperation. You could read an entire community in the sky above its camp who was thriving, who was improvising, who had stopped trying. Inside those circles of heat, conversation and warmth became inseparable. To talk was to stay awake. To stay awake was to feed the fire. Words and embers both kept the cold at bay, and both needed constant tending. Even silence had to be managed, punctuated with the sound of crackling wood, to remind everyone they were still, for now, alive. Over time, warmth itself grew moral weight. To be generous with it became a sign of humanity. To withhold it became a kind of crime. Myths and rituals enshrined that principle. The hearth goddess, the eternal flame, the festival fire carried through generations. The message was clear. The flame you protect protects you back. And that lesson, learned through frostbitten necessity, never quite left the human body. It settled in muscle memory, in the instinct to gather close, to offer a seat near the fire, to treat heat as belonging to no one. Because even as people learned to master warmth, their bodies never forgot who'd taught them its price. And the teacher, as always, was the same, the indifferent instructor that froze fingers and sharpened minds until cooperation became law. But that instruction didn't stop at behavior. It wrote itself into bone and blood, leaving traces that would outlast even memory. The human body is an archive, and the cold wrote some of its best entries. Every adaptation that kept our ancestors alive left a faint annotation in our flesh, a note in the margins of evolution that says, "We've been here before." It's in the way hands curl automatically when the air bites, in how breath shortens, in that small shiver pretending to be optional. The body remembers temperature the way stone remembers pressure, not consciously, but faithfully. Scientists can still see it in bone and blood. Populations shaped by millennia of frost developed shorter limbs and wider torsos, designs built for heat retention rather than grace. Even fat distribution carries geography. Some stored energy closer to the organs, some as a quiet blanket beneath the skin. What looks like variation is actually biography. The mind holds its own thermal memory. Comfort feels safe, not because it's pleasant, but because for most of human history, warmth meant you weren't dying. That's why the modern obsession with coziness, blankets, hot drinks, central heating, feels almost religious. It's not luxury, it's ancestral relief, the nervous system whispering, "We survived again." And then there's shivering, the oldest form of protest. It's an involuntary reminder that your body is still negotiating with physics. When you tremble, you're repeating an ancient agreement: move or freeze. It's the same reflex that once made people huddle together for efficiency, back when every calorie of warmth had to be earned communally. The heart, too, adjusts to the memory. In cold environments, it slows. Blood vessels tighten, rationing heat, prioritizing core over extremity. The body becomes strategic, pragmatic, a small government managing limited resources. Every cell knows the rules. Sacrifice the fingers, save the lungs. Survival is never democratic. Some of this legacy is still alive in unexpected places. In parts of the world where ancestors battled long winters, people retain stronger responses to cold stress, quicker constriction, faster rewarming. The body rehearses for emergencies that may never come. Others, whose lineage grew under generous suns, conserve heat less efficiently, trusting the air to stay kind. Geography outlived the glaciers. Even emotions aren't exempt. Studies show that loneliness and social isolation literally make people feel colder, not metaphorically, but thermally. It's the echo of an older truth. Warmth was once synonymous with proximity. If no one's near, the body assumes danger. Comfort, therefore, remains a collective invention, no matter how many electric heaters we plug in. The irony is that our bodies evolved to endure cold far better than our minds did. We can regulate temperature, build shelter, weave fur into armor, yet the first gust of winter still feels like an insult. The memory isn't pleasant, it's disciplinary. We've been trained to take cold personally because, in the deep past, it was personal. The air remembers too. It enters the lungs, cool and sharp, and triggers a reflex, thousands of years old. That slight pause before exhaling, that primitive question, are we ready for this again? And we are, mostly. But every breath of cold air still wakes the animal that built its life on fear of frost. Because the lessons the body learned from cold weren't just mechanical, they were moral. It taught restraint, discipline, and a particular kind of reverence. The knowledge that life isn't guaranteed, only loaned. The temperature simply decides the interest rate. And from that constant exposure to risk came a strange inheritance. Not just endurance, but pride. The idea that hardship refines character, that frost can sculpt virtue as easily as it shapes stone. It's an old superstition, but one the cold encouraged, over and over again. Hardship didn't just strengthen the body, it polished the spirit into something brittle and efficient. The cold was the first moral philosopher. It rewarded preparation, punished indulgence, and made laziness instantly fatal. Every culture that grew under grey skies learned the same quiet gospel: comfort makes fools, and fools don't last. There's a certain personality born of climates that freeze water mid-air. Caution becomes instinct, patience becomes style, and emotion takes on the rhythm of frost, slow, deliberate, never wasted. In warmer lands, spontaneity was a virtue. In frozen ones, it was a death wish. That's why so many of the world's oldest virtues, restraint, endurance, modesty, have glacial origins. They were simply good survival strategies dressed up as moral insight. The discipline began in necessity. A single careless act could unravel a season's effort. Sleep too long and the fire dies. Spill your fuel and you lose the week. Eat what should be saved, and hunger will come collect. The cold was merciless but consistent, the kind of teacher that gave instant feedback. You didn't need commandments when the climate handled enforcement. Over generations, that pragmatism evolved into something resembling philosophy. Hardship became purification. The sting of frostbite became proof of sincerity. Fasting in winter, enduring exposure, bathing in ice, all these later spiritual practices were just reenactments of survival. The monks who sought enlightenment in snow caves, the ascetics who walked barefoot through frost, they were descendants of people who'd learned that deprivation feels holy when it keeps you alive. Even language remembers the lesson: cold-hearted, cool-headed, icy, calm, all compliments in disguise, born from a world where emotional restraint meant survival. Fire was beautiful, yes, but the cold was dignified. Those who panicked froze faster. Those who planned quietly outlived them. Stoicism wasn't invented in Greece, it was perfected in wind and ice. Communities, too, built their ethics around endurance. Sharing food wasn't generosity, it was law. Boasting, hoarding, or taking more than your share marked you as dangerous. The cold made equality practical. No one was strong enough to survive alone for long. Humility wasn't virtue signaling, it was social engineering. And when the weather softened, the habits stayed. Whole civilizations carried their frost-forged ethics into eras of abundance, still suspicious of ease. Work became moral, struggle became noble, and suffering, especially the silent kind, was rebranded as wisdom. Somewhere along the line, survival turned into character. But beneath that moral armor was something more complicated. The people who endured the worst winters also learned compassion, the sort that doesn't announce itself. You helped others not because it felt good, but because you'd seen what happened when no one did. The cold left no room for cruelty that didn't pay off. And so, the moral code of frost was built. Work quietly, prepare early, share warmth, waste nothing, and never forget how quickly comfort disappears. The cold didn't just shape values, it curated them. It also shaped the very spaces people lived in. The architecture of endurance was born from this moral arithmetic: how to hold warmth, share it efficiently, and make humility a building principle. Walls, like ethics, became thicker, not to show off, but to survive. If the body learned to store warmth, and the mind learned to ration pride, the home learned to trap breath. Cold didn't just sculpt people, it designed their houses. Every wall, every roof, every narrow doorway was an argument against the wind. Architecture, at its root, was the art of defying temperature. The first shelters weren't grand gestures, they were compressions of necessity. People learned that heat doesn't rise, it escapes, and that the most efficient shape wasn't the prettiest one. Round dwellings, domed or half-buried, kept the warmth cycling inward. Corners, though convenient for furniture we didn't yet have, were the enemy. They collected cold like gossip. Earth was the original insulation. Sod, snow, peat, and clay, whatever the ground offered, people stuffed it into the gaps. Some built with bone, others with packed moss or frozen mud. The design principles were universal: shrink the space, lower the ceiling, keep the fire close. The smaller the air volume, the fewer calories it took to heat. Comfort was a matter of geometry. Inside, function dictated intimacy. Sleeping platforms were raised not for luxury but for physics. Heat lingers upward, after all, and families slept shoulder to shoulder, their combined breath warming the air faster than any fire could. Privacy was invented much later, somewhere between central heating and individualism. In the ancient cold, togetherness was insulation. Even ventilation, that small miracle of survival, came with its own precision. Too little and smoke suffocated you. Too much and warmth bled out into the void. So people developed vents, angled like instruments, balancing fire and air in a duet that required constant tuning. Every breath became part of architecture's maintenance. The materials changed with geography, but the philosophy never did. In forests, homes grew from logs chinked with moss. In treeless lands, they were carved from earth or snow. Everywhere, the message was the same. Walls weren't decorations, they were lungs. You breathed through them. And yet, there was beauty in that pragmatism. The snow dome that glowed faintly from within, the smoke hole that framed a pale circle of sky, the faint scent of burning fat in the air. It was an aesthetic born from survival, but it had grace. These homes didn't dominate the landscape. They disappeared into it. They whispered instead of boasting, warmed by humility as much as fire. Later, when societies grew wealthier and architects began chasing symmetry and grandeur, the memory of this quiet intelligence lingered. Thick walls, layered textiles, shared hearths, all inherited from those early engineers of resistance. The cold had forced humanity to think like heat itself, and that lesson never truly thawed. In a way, every modern house still carries that echo. Central heating systems mimic communal fires. Bedrooms are kept small, kitchens warm. Even the instinct to gather in the coziest room is architectural muscle memory, the house reminding us what it was built to prevent. But the genius of those ancient builders wasn't just their efficiency, it was their humility. They didn't try to conquer the weather, they conspired with it. Resistance didn't mean defiance, it meant partnership, letting the earth itself become an ally against the air. And from that alliance emerged something else, the transformation of survival into culture. The cold, once an enemy, began to shape rituals, festivals, and meaning itself. Because once people learned how to outlast it, they needed to explain why they kept returning to it. Endurance, once a matter of calories and luck, turned into ceremony. When survival stopped being a daily cliffhanger, it became performance, a choreography of gratitude and defiance played out every winter. People didn't just endure cold anymore, they celebrated their ability to endure it. That's how the frost became theater. The solstice was the first stage. In almost every ancient calendar, There's a feast marking the longest night, not a victory over darkness, but a handshake with it. The world's first festivals weren't about abundance, they were about endurance in scarcity. Fire lit against the snow wasn't decoration, it was proof. Every spark said, "We're still here." Across continents, the rituals converged. Bonfires, songs, dances, all positioned exactly when the sky felt most indifferent. Some burned effigies of winter spirits, others invited them inside and fed them offerings. Whether the cold was treated as god or monster depended on how generous it had been that year. Either way, people learned that surviving it required more than fuel. It required narrative. Clothing, too, became costume. Furs and hides, once worn out of necessity, turned into symbols of prestige, fertility, or connection to ancestors. What had begun as insulation evolved into identity. To wear warmth was to declare triumph. The heavier the coat, the grander the story. Even the architecture of ceremony carried frost in its bones. Ice caves turned into shrines. Frozen rivers became processional routes. People walked across solid water, as if performing a temporary miracle. Each step reinforced the strange lesson of winter, that the world could become both deadly and sacred with the same breath. And then there was music. In the silence of winter, rhythm mattered. Drums echoed through the snow like heartbeats, reminding the earth that humans were still awake. Songs about fire, hunger, and returning light filled the void. Some of those chants survived thousands of years, repackaged as hymns or carols, long after the cold stopped being a predator. The frost also carved moral parables into memory. Tales of those who hoarded warmth and met bad ends, or of strangers welcomed into huts who later revealed themselves as gods in disguise. All cultural fables of thermal ethics. The fire, it turned out, wasn't just for cooking food, it was for testing character. Even now, traces of those winter values linger. We still light candles in the dark season, gather indoors, and pretend it's about celebration rather than fear. Our holidays, cloaked in lights and comfort, are really rebranded survival rituals, the ancient campfire dressed in electricity. The cold became metaphor to death, rebirth, purity, silence, all borrowed its imagery. Religions learned to freeze and thaw their gods in seasonal rhythm. The divine died in winter and rose again in spring, because even mythology learned thermoregulation. And yet, for all its symbolic grandeur, the cold's greatest cultural contribution was humility. It reminded every generation that progress was rented, not owned. One bad harvest, one long freeze, and civilization would remember who was in charge. Which leads, inevitably, to the final lesson. The cold wasn't just a force to be resisted or revered. It was the ultimate teacher, the one that taught cooperation, patience, art, and reverence for limits. The kind of teacher humanity keeps trying to outgrow, and never quite does. In the end, the cold outlasted every civilization that tried to conquer it. Fire, fur, architecture, all of them were temporary rebellions against a permanent condition. The frost didn't care about progress. It waited, patiently, like it always had. Because the truth is, the cold never lost. It just retreated into metaphor, teaching from the shadows of our thermostats. The great irony is that humanity's triumph over the elements came at the cost of its sharpest instincts. We built walls so thick that we forgot what the air once demanded of us. Central heating smoothed the edges of vigilance. Warmth became constant, and constancy became dull. The body still remembers what it's supposed to do: curl, shiver, huddle, but now it does so in gyms and saunas, performing the old disciplines recreationally. We still chase the sting, though. People plunge into icy lakes for clarity, fast in winter for renewal, run through blizzards just to feel the pulse of something ancient. It's absurd, but deeply human, recreating hardship in an age that's forgotten it. The cold, stripped of its danger, became a therapy. We call it invigorating, as if that word could hide how desperately we miss being humbled. The modern world doesn't revere limits, it negotiates them. But the cold doesn't negotiate, it never did. It's the last honest element, the one that doesn't flatter, doesn't bargain, doesn't explain itself. It strips away everything unnecessary until only the essential remains: breath, body, proximity. It's the universe's simplest form of truth-telling, and maybe that's why it still feels sacred. Even now, in cities humming with artificial warmth, the first frost carries a strange authority. The air changes sharper, cleaner, faintly moral. People instinctively move closer. There's an unspoken truce in that moment. The body recognizing an old tutor in the room. The lesson begins again. For all our technology, for all our climate-controlled arrogance, we still return to those rituals, lighting candles in the dark, making soup, layering fabric over skin, building little pockets of resistance against entropy. It's not nostalgia, it's instinct. A memory passed down through mitochondria that whispers, you owe your survival to discomfort. The cold was never the villain of human history, it was the editor. It cut what was wasteful, tested what was fragile, and left behind only what could think, plan, and share. Without it, there would have been no cooperation, no caution, no art of keeping one another alive. And so it remains, outside our windows and inside our bones, watching, reminding, calibrating. Every chill up the spine, every breath that turns to mist, every involuntary shiver, they're all echoes of that first negotiation between warmth and wisdom. The cold didn't just teach survival, it taught perspective. It's why, even now, comfort feels temporary and struggle feels meaningful. Somewhere deep in the evolutionary archive, we remember, the frost was our first teacher, and the lesson was simple. Nothing worth keeping stays warm forever.